Our second scripture for today comes from the second chapter of the Gospel of John. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here." He told those, "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." And the Jews said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. When he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs of what he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, would not entrust himself to them, people, and needed no one to testify about anyone, for he himself knew what was in everyone. May God bless this reading. Well, we're continuing to work our way through the Gospel of John, and I actually want to take a moment and pause because there's something that I read today that I will not be reading the rest of John, but I wanted you to hear it the way that it is written. And that is that John has this habit of using the term the Jews. This is not used in the other Gospels in the same way. But John often sets Jesus in opposition to that big blanket statement, the Jews. And if you know anything about Christian history, Christians have been absolutely horrendous to the Jewish people. I mean terrible. Murder, violence, all the way up to genocide. And it continues to this day. We are in no means past a world where Jewish people are the target of violence. There was a synagogue in Mississippi burned down just a couple of weeks ago, and the person who burned it down wrote a letter calling it a synagogue of Satan. And this kind of anti-Semitic thought has always been rooted in the idea that Jews are opposed to the ministry of Jesus. And when you read a passage like John 2 in the cleansing of the temple, you kind of get this vision, right? Jesus goes into the temple, and it is the Jews, as John calls them, who are against him. And it even goes as far as people saying that the Jews are the ones who killed Jesus, which I will tell you right now, he was absolutely crucified on a Roman cross, not a Jewish one. And so the church has always struggled with this seen itself as in opposition to the Jewish faith, and it has led to this horrendous history of murder and violence. But I want us to take this word a little bit more critically. How do we understand what John says when he says the Jews in a way that doesn't make it look like it's in opposition to the gospel of Jesus? Because Jesus' critique is not against the Jewish faith. For one thing, everybody you read about in the New Testament, including Jesus himself, are Jewish. He is in the temple at this moment because it is Passover, and as an observant Jew, he goes to the temple to practice his Jewish faith. And so the biblical scholar Caroline Lewis has recommended that we actually don't translate this word as the Jews, but rather we use the term the Jewish leaders, which is what I'm going to do from now on as we go through the Gospel of John. Because what is happening here is not the gospel being opposed to an entire faith group. Rather, this is an internal dialogue within the Jewish faith of the first century. Jesus is an educated teacher who is called a rabbi, and he has followers, and he is in this internal debate with other practitioners of his faith about what it looks like to be faithful. So Jesus' critique is not about the entire Jewish faith, but rather it is about the role that the temple religion and practice plays in his culture. And it is about its mission to direct people to the presence of God and God's concern. And in Jesus' time, what Jesus' critique is that the temple has become stale. It is hidden behind ritual and rules rather than seeking the living presence of the divine. And the thing with reading it this way is, I don't know if you can do this. We're going to do a little imagination exercise. Can you imagine a religious institution getting stuck in the past? I know it's hard to wrap your mind around that idea. Can you imagine a religious institution, say a church, failing to adapt to the changing world? Can you imagine a religious institution using its power to maintain its own status in the world? I know it's way out there. You've probably never seen anything like it before. But that's the thing, when you read what Jesus is doing in the temple, you have to remember that there is something about religious institutions that we get stuck from time to time. And if we're honest, we too are susceptible to this. Our faith is meant to be living out in the world, present, and yet we can get stuck. And so in the same way that Jesus goes into the temple and flips the tables, it can be helpful in our own lives for somebody to flip our tables, wake us up to what's going on. And when you look at this temple scene, you've got to understand that there are some things going on here that aren't quite clear to us right off the bat. Jesus, for one thing, is not mad as such that people are selling things in the temple. It's easy to look at this, and I've heard churches say that, well, this passage means you shouldn't ever sell anything in the church. And that's not exactly what's happening. Because what the people are selling, what is listed in this passage as what they are selling, are actually the animals that are needed for religious practice. The Old Testament, around these festivals, there would be sacrifices, and the Old Testament lays out what kind of a sacrifice you ought to bring, whether it be a cattle or a dove. And so these people are set up in the courtyard to help make the festival of Passover happen. And the reason that they're set up in the temple is that part of the Jewish faith is that you would travel back to the temple for Passover. And at this point in time, there are Jews all over the ancient world. The Roman Empire expands thousands of miles, and there are Jews who are making the trip back to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover. And if you choose to make the pilgrimage, you're probably not going to bring your offering with you, because traveling with an entire ox, not super convenient. And you can't ship it ahead of you. There is no UPS. And so the temple sellers would set up in the courtyard, and you would be able to go and buy the animal you need for your religious practice. And then you have the money changers, because somebody coming from way, way, way in the West might have a different currency than what they have in Jerusalem, so you have to come and do your conversion and get your money switched out. So what these folks in this courtyard are doing is it's not illegal. It's not even against what the Bible dictates. They are just helping the religious system function efficiently. But I think it is exactly because this religious system of this time has become so obsessed with right processes that causes Jesus to get frustrated. Because the temple system of his time had failed to be any kind of a prophetic voice for God's kingdom. The temple system is perfectly willing to go through the motions of religious obedience, perfectly willing to follow the rules, perfectly willing to comply with the authorities. But they have lost the spark of God's call. And more so, they have ignored the injustices around them. Jesus' entire ministry, you have to place his entire ministry on the backdrop of the very precarious position that Israel finds itself in at that time. In the first century, Israel is under Roman occupation. There is a foreign army. There have been attempts at insurrection. They have been violently put down. Just years before Jesus' birth, an insurrection is put down, and they line the street with crucified bodies. There are, of course, tributes expected. You know, it's funny, we live in a culture in which there is taxation with representation. We vote on more or less, hopefully, how our money is spent in tax money. There's no illusion of that. Taxes in the ancient world, they are a tribute to Rome so that Rome can do what it wants. And it is the exact reason there is a census in Luke, in the beginning of Luke. You count people so you know how much to tax them. There are hostile soldiers walking around the street making sure law and order is upheld. And they have the clear message, don't be disruptive and we will leave you alone, mostly. And there are those in Jesus' time who thought this was the best course of action. They thought that compliance was the right way to respond to this. And you can think about the figures that we know in the New Testament. Think about King Herod. King Herod is Jewish, and yet he is playing along because they let him be king, because they gave him some privilege. They gave him a nice, beautiful palace. There are even religious leaders. The Sadducees are one of the sects that come to mind who think the best course of action is simply cooperating with the empire. It's like there's this attitude that if we can just cooperate with the Romans, everything will be all right. Of course, there will be moments when violence flares up, but at least we can secure a little bit of privilege for ourselves within the system. So for the temple and the religious leaders of their time, it's not so much that they want to cooperate with the Romans. It's that they know they'll be able to secure something close to business as usual if they don't worry too much about what's going on around them. So you can imagine for those around Jesus, these felt like extraordinary times, like times when business as usual was simply not going to work. And so we have to think about Jesus' words and his actions in this passage in that context. It's not that Jesus doesn't believe in the temple as an institution. It's that he is not happy with it thinking it can do the bare minimum of religious practice and observance. It's that he does not think that the purpose of the temple is the efficient functioning of a religious system. And we know, because we've been reading John, that God is not about neat and orderly functioning. Rather, we see who and what God is in the presence of Jesus. We've already heard at the wedding of Cana, God is about abundance. God is about a ministry that doesn't stay holed up in the temple, but rather goes where the people are. We know that God's presence is with those in need, who hunger and thirst, who worry about whether or not their neighbors will be the victims of violence by the empire. I'm just struck by how little time Jesus spends inside religious buildings and how often he is on plains and mountains near the people. And I have a little bit of sympathy for the temple folks of this time, right? I think we all can muster up a little bit, because one of the things that religion does offer us is consistency. And that's not a bad thing. I don't generally believe in big blanket statements about humans, but I do think the vast majority of people want things that are pretty stable and predictable. You know, we all love spontaneity from time to time, going on an adventure, but I will tell you, I want nothing more than to fall asleep in my own bed and to wake up and make coffee my way every morning. And I think church is the same way. Church provides these rhythms, the way that we do it week after week. And it can be really great to hear the hymns we like or to enjoy a particular worship space. It is comforting to have that kind of consistency. And yet, there's this slim line between something giving us comfort and something pacifying us and quieting our faith. We either get attached and fight for it to stay the same, or we ignore what's beyond the purview of the religious institution. Anything outside of religious talk distracts us from what God really cares about, which is what happens inside of the building. And this is what I think Jesus is rallying against. Because Jesus doesn't really want us just to spend all of our time in this building. And we know that because Jesus spends hardly any of his time in the religious buildings of his time. He does go to the temple, he does go to synagogue, and then he goes out. And you'll notice the vast majority of the story, of the signs, of the miracles happen everywhere else but in the religious space. And so those of us who are invested in the church life, every once in a while need our own tables flipped. And the way that happens is to remember that the goal of faith is not what happens here on Sunday morning, but the goal of faith is a life lived in pursuit of the teachings of Jesus, of love and justice and mercy for all people. In one of my favorite theological traditions called liberation theology, there's this saying that theology is meant to be a critical reflection on praxis, which is a lot of big words. But what it really means is you go out into the world, into your life, and you seek to do what Jesus did. You love others, you break down barriers, you seek justice. And then you come back into this place and reflect on what it all means. Not least of all, how have you been changed by that work? And in my own life, I have noticed this pattern, right? I think in my own life about what it is that has changed me. When have my tables been flipped? When has what I have known to be true of the world just been completely thrown out the window? And you know, it's most often when I meet somebody who shares an experience that is different from my own, and that is different enough that it makes me rethink my place in the world. So I thought about this week. I have a couple of moments. When I was in college, I went to college in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is way, way north in Arizona, near the Grand Canyon. People don't believe me. It's in the middle of one of the largest ponderosa pine forests in the world. It snows there a lot in Arizona. But it is also in really close proximity to several First Nations reservations. The Navajo, the Hopi, the Apache, all have reservations near the campus. And so when I was in college, I would have these classes with folks, and I would learn the stories. I would hear about how folks from the Navajo people, they were removed from their homes as kids and then forced to not speak their native languages. I would hear the stories of how in native cultures, often having long hair is a religious practice, and how they would show up at boarding schools and have their hair shaved off so that they would look more, quote unquote, civilized. And it caused me to rethink what I understood about American history and faith. You know, when I got to divinity school, I went to school in Nashville, Tennessee. And in my classes, there were a large number of African American students studying to be ministers. And I had never really thought about what my whiteness meant for privilege until I heard some of these students talk about they would go to work as ministers at these big steeple churches in Nashville, Tennessee, and regularly would be pulled over on the way to work as pastors. Something that to this day has not happened to me. And I had to rethink what I understood about race and privilege in our country. I have been in circles of clergy women ordained to ministry, and have heard the comments that get made about them, about their appearance, about how they dress. I had a friend in seminary who was told that she really should cut her hair shorter. I mean, goodness. And it made me rethink my position as a male minister. What does that privilege mean? And right now, as a country, we're looking at what's going on in places like Minneapolis and Chicago and LA. And what we know must also be going on in a quieter way in Jacksonville. And we have to wonder, what is the role of people of faith at this time? And I don't know that I totally know the answer, or I know the answer and I almost don't want to admit it yet. But the point is, we go through these interactions, these experiences, and we have to rethink what our faith looks like, what it is Jesus is demanding of us. And can it be difficult? Yes. Can it lead to crises of faith? Yes. And yet we know to not be challenged would be like the temple leaders of Jesus, asking him to please not make such a big mess. Frederick Douglass once said that those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are the people who want crops without plowing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. And I know that he was talking about social movements. This line actually ends with the line that Martin Luther King Jr. was so fond of saying, power demands nothing without demand. But I think this also can be true of our interior lives. It's okay to seek comfort in religion, but it becomes true religion not when it avoids the challenges of the world, but rather when we experience the kind of turbulence and agitation that produces a bigger, broader, more inclusive love. When we are challenged to examine our own lives and practices, we are pulled forward in faith. And the best way to do this is to follow Jesus into the world. After all, the temple is no longer a place, it is the life that Jesus lives. So I think about all the ways that we as people of faith are called into the world. Here at church, we can talk about work down at desk and downtown. We can talk about the Nehemiah Assembly and I Care. We can talk about the opportunities for conversation with people who are different than us in this place. We can talk about work with CEW in the local schools. We could even talk about conversations with local immigrant communities here in town and look at the work that folks like One Jacks are doing to try to create a more secure Jacksonville. But the message of Scripture is that if those things make you uneasy, if it makes you nervous, if it makes you worried, that's okay. That is the sound of faith growing. Find comfort when you need it, but don't shy away from those spaces where our tables are flipped.